handling horses and cattle. And in those days, a boy that got to be 16 years old that couldn't drive 4 horses or more or couldn't ride a horse, why, he'd just about as well go off and die because there was nothing else to do. And, well, I come here with my parents and my brothers and sisters in October of 1890.
Mm-hmm.
And
where did you live first?
Coulterville, Mariposa
Oh,
County.
I see. And you came here from there.
I was born in Coulterville.
I see.
And my parents had been sold out under a mortgage there, and my father had been here in early days. My father was down here on Fine Gold in 1852.
Oh.
And he remembered this country, and then we had a friend that had been over there that moved here and lived down near where the powerhouse is now, and my folks come here for that reason.
Mm-hmm.
And, that winter, along in December, why, my father hired me with 4 horses that we owned and to work for Mr. Chapin at Cascadel. Mr. Chapin put in 2 more horses and made 6 horses. And so the first thing, they sent me to Madera to get a load of wheat. At that time, Mr. Chapin had rented what is known as the Joe Good Ranch and was farming the Joe Good Ranch, and they sent me down for a load of wheat, and I got 3 tons and a quarter of wheat, and which was a pretty darn big load for the roads and the ways we had of getting around then, doing things. And however, I got up as far as Fine Gold with a little over 3 tons of wheat. Well, then a man that was Bill Ritchie that was stopping there that night at Fine Gold told me that I could never pull it on to North Fork, and I took him at his word. So I broke it in 2 there and brought half of it up one day and went back the next day and got the other half of it. Well, I worked for Mr. Chapin for a month or 6 weeks in that way, and then Mr. Chapin didn't need me anymore. Why, I worked at home until the box factory at North Fork started. I went to work on it in March and worked there all summer, the summer of 1891. 10 hours a day for $1 a day,
Really?
plus my board.
Oh, boy, that was something. Did they feed you all right?
No, the food was very poor.
Oh,
They had a Chinese cook, and he just about bossed the thing. He done as he pleased. The food was very poor.
Tell about that awful road coming down from the lumber company, Gus, and how you had to break the wagon.
Well,
You wouldn't believe it, looking at it.
do you see the Peckinpah Mill, the original Peckinpah Mill where they first settled, was about 5,500 feet high. The Brown Mill, which was a mile this side of the Peckinpah Mill, was not quite so high. But from South Fork to either one of those mills, why, you climbed about somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 feet in elevation in 6 miles, which made a very steep road. It was a very poor road to begin with. It had first been used by Jesse Ross and his brother. They made shakes up there. Let's see, I was thinking about the elevation, wasn't I?
Yes, that steep.
It was a very cheap road to begin with. It had only been used by the Ross brothers, Jesse Ross and Cal Ross, to bring shakes down the mountains, mostly with a sled. And they gradually made it a little bit better until Cal Ross, who perhaps was the first man that ever drove more than 2 horses up and down the hill, got to going up and down there with a 4-horse team. That perhaps was along in the late 70s or early 80s. The Peckinpahs were here when I come here in 1890. I have always understood that there was 6 Peckinpah men that come here, and 1 more, Henry Peckinpah, that stayed back in their native states of Indiana, never did come west. There were 6 of them. They were all big men. They were all hard workers. They were sober, very sober men. They had no use for liquor in any way. And they used no tobacco except one. They had one brother, a David Peckinpah, that would smoke a cigar once in a while. But he was not a habitual smoker. And they started the first mill, as I understand it. That was before my time by about 5 years. What is still the old Peckinpah mill site. It's known by most everybody by the great big pile of sawdust that there is there.
The biggest pile I ever saw.
Yeah, there's a pile of sawdust there that covers a few acres.
Yeah.
And, well, that was the first site. And they got along in a very primitive way there for years and years. They, one of the brothers, Abraham Peckinpah, passed away pretty early, in early 1891, I think it was. And then another one, John Peckinpah, who for a few years ran a harness and saddle shop in Northport. His little shop and house where he lived was just about on the corner where the Italian hotel or saloon or whatever it is. It was right on that corner. And until he got too old, and then he went up to the mill and did as much as he could for a few years, but he soon died and was buried up to the mill. Later moved to Sebastopol in Sonoma County. And they was 3 of them that never married and 3 that did marry. Edgar Peckinpah, yes, Edgar Peckinpah was married and had no children, and David Peckinpah was married and had no children. And Charlie Peckinpah, or C.M. Peckinpah, he didn't marry until about the spring of 1891. He married a San Francisco girl who had never been out of the city hardly, and took her up there and kept her there most of the time for 10 or 15 years. They had 3 sons. One of them lives in Fresno now. The other one is up in Willows in Yolo County, I think it is. And the third one, David, who got to be quite a prominent lawyer and was later a superior judge in Madera County, passed away 3-4 years ago. Yeah. But they lived up there during the winter time, all winter long.
Is that right? They couldn't get out, could they?
Well, there was oft times 6, 8 feet of snow, sometimes 10.
I know.
But the last time I ever seen her, I knew her very, very well, and the last time I ever seen her, we was talking about the old times, and she says, well, it was kind of hard going, but she says, I'd like to go back and go through it all again.
Is that right?
I believe she told the truth. And,
oh, their lives really depended on what they did, didn't it? I mean, they really took care of themselves.
Oh, yes. And,
the mills that they used to have, is that how they ever got it?
Well, they after they got the lumber cut and piled up, the question was to sell it and get the money out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now that lumber, most of it had to be hauled to Fresno or maybe to Madera. They run a lumber yard in Madera for a number of years, and later on to Friant.
Mm-hmm.
And that meant a lot of horses and mules and wagons and bad roads.
Oh, I can imagine.
Yeah, from the Peckinpah mill or the Brown mill, when you first started down the hill, you come down the old granite hill. It was very steep. There was just a little of the steepest part of it was about 32%. And teams never could have held their wagons coming down there if it had not been for the fact that the soil conditions there was a loose granite. Of course, a lot of rock, but there was a lot of loose granite, and the brakes would hold the wagons in the granite, but not on hard land. But oftentimes the teamsters had to use what was known as a shoe they put on the front wheel, and that slid one of the front wheels, and they would use that for the very worst places. And a good 10-animal team could make a trip if nothing happened, if he didn't have no sick horses or broke down his wagon or anything. If nothing happened, why, they could make a trip to Peckinpah Mill and back in 6 days. And a good team with a good driver could haul about 8,000 feet of dry lumber.
6 days.
And there was a lot of talk then about teamsters. Some were good, and some were indifferent, and some were poor.
Oh, I imagine.
But they was, once in a while somebody got hurt. I don't think there ever was any man killed up on this mountain. There was one wreck there that a man got pretty badly mashed up. I guess he died from it 3 or 4 years afterwards. And now over on Pine Ridge, in Fresno County, conditions were very similar to what they had here, but they had lots of accidents over there. Pine Ridge was called the graveyard of Fresno County for a number of years.
Was it steeper over there, or did they just happen to?
Well, it was steeper, and I don't know just why. I tell you, in my own mind, I think there was too much drinking over there.
There was a lot of drinking in those days, wasn't
Yeah,
there?
oh,
These
yes,
were
lots of it.
Tough men.
Now, there was 2 or 3 saloons on the top of Pine Ridge. Up here, there never was a saloon got on the top of the hill. They was liquor at North Fork, and there was a place that sold liquor up where the mission is now.
Yeah.
It used to be called the Bucket of Blood.
Jim Geddes told me about that one.
Yeah, and well, now they could get liquor there, but the teamsters may be going up. In the first place, I think there was a better quality of men here.
Oh,
I used to see those Pine Ridge teamsters. Used to come together. We used to go to Friant and stay all night, and then to Fresno. Well, on the top of the hill, 10 miles this side of Fresno, was the old Lane Station. I think there's some of it there yet.
Oh.
Well, there's where the Pine Ridge teamsters and the North Fork teamsters got together.
I see.
And oftentimes they was demonstration as to who was the best man.
Yeah, who could drink the most.
Yeah. And, well, now there was several teamsters here that teamed for years and years and years, and never had any serious accidents, never killed up any horses or broke up any wagons. Well, of course, once in a while there was some fellow that would go be skirk about something or other. I had a friend, he was a Dane, Pete Anderson, and he drove a 6-horse check team. And he was a good man, been raised in Denmark, didn't know much about horses and mules and wagons and things here, but in the early days, why, lots of them got a few head of horses and drove team. They thought they'd like to do that. Well, old Pete was a pretty good man. He did pretty well with his team, too. And so he was coming down the hill one morning with his 6-horse check team that he drove from a seat and had 6 lines, a line on each horse.
On each horse. That's what you mean by a check team.
That's a check team.
I see.
A jerk line team, or a long line, as lots of them call it, is where the man rides a horse and just has one line and guides his mules by gee and haw.
Yeah.
And that is considered easier and better, but the check teams, they are used mostly in breaking young horses and things like that. Well, anyway, Pete had only been married a short time before, a month or two, and he had married a girl from down near O'Neill's, and he was coming down one morning. The hill was kind of slick, and I was right behind him, but I had a bigger outfit and had better control, I guess. And anyway, coming down what was known as the S-turn, why, it kind of got away from old Pete, and he finished the last part of it very fast.
Oh.
However, he wound up at the bottom and run into a bank, and his lead wagon tipped over, but I could see him very plain. That old fellow, he jumped off of a wagon seat was as high as this room, and he hit the ground on his feet with all 6 lines, holding them right. And he talked to the horses a little bit, and they stopped, so there wasn't anybody hurt. There no horses was hurt. But I never will forget, he was very enthusiastic about his marriage, and I got my team stopped. I had to tie all the brakes and everything. I was afraid to let them stand without fear a brake might fly off or something. But my team was still on the bad part of the hill, but I ran down there to see if I could help him. And the first thing he says to me, he says, "By Jesus Christ, I got to write a letter tell my wife Dole about this."
Oh. That's a good one.
and I can see him yet, standing there all excited, and his wife Dora was they'd only been married a month or two.
Well, he must have really had presence of mind
Yes, he done very well. He done much better than lots of men would have done.
So in the fall, when they shut down the box factory.
In the fall, after the lumber got wet and they couldn't mill the lumber anymore, why, they got rid of lots of their men and boys. There's lots of boys worked in that box factory, but kept a skeleton crew and done some lumber hauling all winter and some little mill work. Well, there was a Westmore, a teamster, had come down the mountain 2 or 3 days before, and he'd run his trail wagon off of the road and tipped it over and left it laying there. So one morning, Mr. Bartram, who was one of the heads of the North Fork Lumber Company, went to an old fellow that was working there, John H. Oster. He used to live down near O'Neill's. He was a very well-liked man. And he says to Mr. Oster, he said, "John," he says, "you think you could take 4 horses and go up there and get that wagon out where Westmore left it and bring it down here and we'll get it fixed up?" And again, And Mr. Oster says, oh, he says, I never handle no horses. I don't know how to drive any team, but he says, get that kid there. He can do it. He pointed to me.
Oh.
I was supposed to be done, and but I was over there for some reason. And so Barton turned around and he says, oh, yes, Willie. He says, you was driving horses here last winter. And I said, yes. Well, he says, if I sent Mr. Oster up there, you think you can get that wagon out and bring it down here so that we can have it fixed and get to using it? And, well, I said, I guess so. So I got the horses out, and Mr. Oster and I went up there. I rode one of the horses and led the others, and Oster, he walked. He wouldn't ride a horse.
He wouldn't ride a horse.
In all the 50 years that I knew him, I never had seen him ride a horse. And
he just went along sort of for the to chaperone you.
so we went up there and got the chain loose, let the lumber out, tipped the wagon back, and when I got it up in the road, why, I says to Mr. Oster, I says, Oster, we can take that lumber down just as well as not. And he says, well, it'll be much harder to hold it. Well, I says, we tie a little tree behind. And, well, he says, if you think you can do it, why, all right. Well, I said, sure, I can do it. It wasn't very much, perhaps 2,000 feet or something like that. So we had to pick the lumber up out of a gulch where it had landed way down below the road and pack it up one board at a time. But we put it on the wagon, and the wagon had only a trail tongue in it. That made it kind of hard to steer, you know. But I cut a pine bone stuck in there and lengthened the tongue out some, and then we tied quite a good sized pine tree behind it that was enough to hold it, and we pulled it to Norfolk. When I got there, well, I never will forget that Mr. Bartram come out and looked. He says, is that all of the lumber? And I says, yes, sir. Well, he says, I didn't expect you to get the lumber. I just wanted, he was glad that you could get the wagon. And, well, the wagon wasn't hurt very much. The brake was kind of knocked out. So then after that, why, I drove one of their teams down this side of Clovis. They had a ranch down there called Garfield. And I took one of their teams down there, in fact, the same team that I drove down the hill. And they parked it there for the wintertime. Most of those teams, that when it got too wet and the road got too bad up here, why, they kept them down there and plowed with them, you know, and leveled land and all of those things.
Well, then the next year you worked for him again. I mean, the next summer.
Well, I was kind of independent. Pretty early in the year, why, Mr. Bartram says to me, he says, Willie, are you coming to work for us again this summer? And I says, well, I don't know. I says, I think I ought to have more money. I only got $1 a day last year. I think I can beat it. Well, he says, if you'll come and stay and behave yourself like you did last summer, well, we'll pay you $35 a month. And that was pretty good, you know. So I says, well, all right, then I'll come.
That was 6 days a week.
That was 6 days a week. And so I went, and I'd worked 2 or 3 days.
10 hours a day.
By that time, they had a fellow by the name of Beeson, who was related to him in some way. I don't know just what he had to do with it. Maybe he had put some money into it. But he says to me rather very abruptly one morning, after I'd only worked 2 or 3 days, he says, how much do you think you're getting here this summer? And I says, well, Mr. Bartram said I'd get $35 a month. And he says, you'll get no such a thing. You'll get $1 a day. Well, I says, you take your job and go to hell with it. I'm not going to work for you, and I didn't. But
Then you had to hunt another job.
yeah. So I come home, we settled over here where my brother lives now. That was our home till I bought this place. And
That was the family home where Walt lived.
yes,
Uh-huh.
yes.
House burned.
And
That's just the shack.
I come home, and I told my father I'd quit, and he felt pretty bad about it. He says, well, he says, I don't blame you, but he says, I don't know. In those days, it wasn't so easy to get a job. And but within a day or two, I got a job working with a man baling hay. And I got $2 a day at that.
Oh.
And I worked for him about 3 weeks, as long as he baled hay in this neighborhood. And I worked about 3 weeks, I think it was. And then I come home and I was going up to the SoCal in California mill. They hired lots of men up there, but they didn't want boys very much.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to tell you a little story about that. But I'd only been home a day or so till John Walker, that used to live down below here, come and offered me a job of $50 a month to drive a 6-horse team.
Oh.
And so I got my $50 a month there, and I worked there 4 years.
Uh-huh.
And got more.
What were you doing for him?
Driving a team.
For lumber?
Well, hauling lumber, freight.
I see, back and forth to
The
back.
year round. They hauled lumber in the summertime and hauled wood, and hauled posts, and hauled shakes. And
I see.
you see, all those fellows up on the hill in the early days would, if they had a lot of shakes, why they'd get them down to South Fork or North Fork, and then they'd get them to Fresno during the winter.
Mm-hmm.
Or if they had a lot of posts, and they was oftentimes be a lot of lumber. The Peckinpahs had lumber to haul most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
I'll shut that off. I'll tell you.